Good morning, everybody. This is your favorite farmer Paul here, and I'm trying a slightly different video style because I want to cover a relatively large volume of information that's going to span over the course of a whole calendar year. I had a request from a commenter to talk about sheep specifically. I'm happy to talk about sheep. In fact, I can probably kill a party if somebody asks me about sheep, but hopefully you won't feel like it's too boring. Sheep are easy. They are gentle creatures and they are pretty easy to work with. Furthermore, I really enjoy the idea of being a shepherd. The Bible makes a lot of references to sheep and shepherds, and it gives you a whole new level of insight into what some of those texts are referring to. I've said it before, but when God calls us his sheep, it's not really a compliment. Yeah, they're not the brightest animals. So what are sheep? Sheep are herbivorous ruminants. Herbivorous meaning that they only eat plants. Specifically, sheep are grazers, which means most of the day they're going to spend their time with their head down grazing grass at the ground level. Sheep are good grazers. They clip the grass as opposed to tugging the grass. This encourages actual grasses to grow, whereas some people contend that, say, goats, who are more prone to tugging at plants, will uproot weak or young root systems and leave only the more brushy forbs. They will not clip it in a fashion that looks like it was mowed. It will keep it under control. If you live in a region where wildfires are a concern, keeping biomass down, especially dry biomass, it's a legitimate concern, and this is a good way to accomplish that, especially without burning more fossil fuels as you would with mowing. Believe it or not, that was our initial motivation for getting sheep. Was I spent one summer mowing what you now see as our pasture, and I said never again. I'm not going to waste all my summers doing that and just wasting hours on a tractor or a mower. So we got 5 lambs, and we've never looked back. We've had sheep ever since, and I don't intend to get rid of them. Now, the word ruminant, in short, that means they have multiple stomachs. The grass is regurgitated up into their mouth where they chew on it as cud, and then is swallowed back down into the rumen, which is a stomach specifically designed, if you will, for the breakdown of grass and cellulose. We'll talk more about their diets shortly. Sheep are gentle creatures, and I've seen people train them to the hand in ways that my sheep have not achieved. My sheep are still quite jittery, which I view as a survival trait. While I love them and I like them a whole bunch, I don't need to cuddle with them. If they see something they think it might be threatening, I would prefer they run away from it. Though we have a few sheep that we've had either nursed back to health or bottle fed, they will come right up to us, eat right out of our hand. It's pretty adorable. An early winter on our property, we had 1 ram and 2 dogs. Pretty sure he thought he was a dog. When I'd sit down by the pond, the dogs would come up and sit next to me, and he would come and put his head right on my shoulder. That was all very adorable until he decided to burp up some cud to chew while we sat. Let me tell you, you haven't experienced grass until you've smelled a cud burp from a sheep at point blank range. Now, that being said, that same ram, we kept him for several years as our stud ram. Obviously, eventually he was related to everybody, so that wasn't going to work forever. He got up to about 5 years old, I think, and he started to become territorial, which I wouldn't worry too much about, except the fact that he got so territorial that he would try to ram me while I was on the lawnmower. He would charge me all the time. He got a free trip to a freezer camp. I realized that might be hard for some folks to accept, but at the end of the day, we raise these animals to help manage the pasture and for meat. That's always been the circumstance for us here. It's never been a question. A lot of people ask how my daughter deals with this, and she has understood from the very start. One time she asked if there was going to come a day when we were going to butcher the dog. And I told her very calmly that we would never butcher the dog, and we had a discussion regarding the difference between livestock and pets, and she's never had problems with it since. Kids are a lot more resilient than we give them credit for. They can understand a lot more than we give them credit for as well. She's been raised up in this way of life, so it's not strange to her at all. I mentioned we only raise our sheep for managing the pasture and meat. A lot of people raise sheep for wool. However, the breed of sheep that we raise, which is kind of a mix of Katahdins, and I think there's a little Dorper in there, they are hair sheep, which I believe is a trait that originally came from African sheep. I could be mistaken there, don't quote me. Hair sheep do not grow wool in the sense that we typically think of. The wool production that is characteristic of English sheep, Irish and Scottish, I believe New Zealand sheep as well. These sheep don't do that. They grow a much more coarse hair, and they actually shed their coats once a year. Now, since my sheep are not purebreds, not all of them shed their coat perfectly. That is generally considered to be an undesirable trait in this type of sheep. But seeing as they're just for meat, I'm not that worried about it. If I have to make decisions about who stays and who goes, I consider those things, but it's not a critical factor that I need to get rid of. Wool sheep are a slightly different game, and I'm sorry because I don't know anything about wool. Now, how does one contain sheep? Around here, it's important that we do contain our animals. Some people believe in open ranging and just letting it run its course. Around here, we have a lot of coyotes, and probably the worst thing is we have a lot of stray dogs. Most wild animals only kill things when they're hungry. Feral dogs, they will kill just for fun. They will work through livestock animals and just leave them to rot in the field. So we contain our sheep within a fence. Our fence was here when we bought the property. I didn't realize how much of a blessing it was until we started getting animals. We have a 2x4 horse wrap non-climb wire, I believe it's what it's called. So we use that as our main interior perimeter. We also have used 4 and 5 stranded hot wire put up with simple insulating posts and other plastic insulators. And while those do work well, an electric fence is a psychological barrier, whereas a heavy wire fence, that is a physical barrier. A sheep cannot push through that. They can't. Given enough motivation, they might be able to scramble over it, but that'd be something else. A few hot wire strands are a psychological barrier. They touch it, it hurts, they don't want to touch it again, but they could easily push through it given the proper motivation. Or, in the case of hair sheep in particular, they can push through it when the tufts of their hair are thick enough that the wire never actually makes contact with their skin. That we have found to be a problem. We dealt with that for several years, and then we learned about electrified netting. Specifically, we use Premier One electrified netting. They are not a sponsor of mine, though that would make me happier than... I don't even know. I can't think of something that would be that happy. Anyway, Premier One fencing is an excellent product. As you can see, within that netting is fine wires wound up throughout the mesh, and the posts are easily movable as long as the ground isn't too hard. Now, that being said, it is still a psychological barrier. If I were to completely ignore them, not give them water or food, then their motivation would become strong enough to challenge that border. That is the main duty for sheep, monitoring their pasture and making sure that they have enough forage to keep them happy and access to good water. So we use high intensity grazing. That sounds bad at first because a lot of people would think high intensity grazing, that would be bad for the land. What they actually mean is the labor is high intensity. It's real easy just to shove some animals in a pasture and close the gate. That would be low intensity grazing. Whereas high intensity grazing is we move them regularly. It's also called rotational grazing. So we have a series of paddocks set up around our property that typically are adjacent to each other, and you can let the sheep from the paddock they are in into the next paddock and close that up. By doing this, I'm able to leapfrog those electric fence nets. This allows a lot of my pasture to remain open of fencing, and that's just nice when I need to move through the pasture. Also, it's just visually more appealing in general. The paddocks rotate around a central area with a little shed in it that provides shelter no matter what paddock they're in. It also is a central watering point for them. which is wonderful. And I run water to that area. In regards to running water, the current system is a trenched line out to that area and just a wash tub basin with a float valve in it. Typical stock tank float valve. You can find it at Tractor Supply for less than 20 bucks. And it works most of the time. I still recommend that you cast an eye over your water source regularly, at least once a day, just to make sure that the water has not become fouled unnecessarily, to make sure that the valve is working properly, make sure there's still water there, and make sure it's not overflowing. Some of the benefits of rotational grazing is that it gives the land time to rest from the animals. By that I mean bugs get time to break down the leavings from the livestock. Some people will rotate chickens shortly behind their livestock and capitalize on some of the larvae coming out of the droppings as a sort of a free protein source, which is a great idea, but I usually cannot move my chickens that often. Maybe if I had a little help or I didn't have to go to a day job, I could manage that. Another good aspect about rotational grazing is that it actually promotes a more balanced ecology for the ground itself. If you were to think of the great buffalo herds that roamed the Central Plains several hundred years ago, they would cross over an area and really just devastate it, as far as they would clip everything because there was so much immediate competition in that moment that everything got eaten. Nothing was spared, and they would move on to another area, and the area that they had grazed would be left to recover. And this tries to simulate that activity. Obviously, my little acreage is not big enough for me to have them move on in such a mass migration. However, I can force them out of an area with my electric fencing and force them into an area where they eat their favorite plants first, and then after a day or two, all of those favorites have been chomped down and there's nothing left but their not so favorites. And as the shepherd, you just sit back and make sure they eat those too, and then you let them move on. Otherwise, their favorite plants get eaten down continuously and eventually they can't recover, and then you end up with a pasture completely full of undesirable plants. Now, there are further components to this. In a perfect world, you would time their rotations so that the grass is in an intermediate stage of growth, not while it's young and tender, and not when it's old enough to have gone to seed. That's really where it has the most nutrition for your livestock. I am not able to time that. I just rotate them based off of how much they have grazed down. But somebody who's better with time management could probably do it. Let me segue into my next topic. Leaving sheep on a plot of ground too long. Initially, I was really expecting the sheep to eat the grass and plants down further than they do, and so I would try to leave them in there much longer than what they should have been. And I've since learned that you really don't want them to graze down lower than 6 inches. This is because 6 inches down, they will start to come in contact with more potential sources of infection. There is, at least in my area, something called the barber pole worm, accounts for a large proportion of sick sheep. The reality is, almost all sheep are going to get parasites to some degree. It is really a question of regulating the load of parasites in their body. You want to have sheep that are hardy enough and not succumb to them and die. I can't remember where I heard this most recently, but there are 4 S's when it comes to sheep, and they're unfortunate. Sick sheep seldom survive. And that is a sad truth I have found. Sheep are largely prey animals, and prey animals don't want to appear ill because that makes them an easy target. So usually by the time you can tell a sheep is sick, they are really sick. You should consider a relationship with your local veterinarian that deals in large animals or farm animals. It can be a difficult decision because it can be financially strapping. As wealthy as homesteading is bound to make us all, we still have to consider how much things cost. The local farm stores usually have medications available. However, you will need to do some research or go on the recommendation of a local veterinarian to see which medications would be appropriate. Not all medications treat all things. So do your research, talk to the professionals. All that being said, we have nursed several sheep back to health, and they're still with us today. That is wonderful and very gratifying. But I have dug a lot of holes in my career as a shepherd as well. I tell you, there's nothing that ruins your day more than having to bury an animal that relied on you for everything. It is really hard when you work so hard for them and it's just not enough. But that is something you need to accept as a shepherd. You are going to lose them. Say it with me. I am going to lose sheep. It's a fact. The sooner you accept it, the better off you'll be. You also need to realize that most of the time it's not your fault. Even if it is your fault, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you learn and don't do that again. If you find yourself making the same mistakes over and over again, all right, start beating yourself up. But until that happens, learn and move forward. You guys are smart. That's not going to happen to you. Some things that you can do to help avoid this with sheep is make sure they stay on a varied diet. A good way to do that is rotational grazing, because it promotes a more diverse ecology in your pasture. If you are working with a plot of land that was previously, say, just a cultivated lawn, you are going to have a monoculture of Bermuda grass or something similar. You want to have diversity in your pasture, preferably local or native plants that are going to grow well and be hardy. If you end up having to buy hay in, I would recommend that you talk to the person that you're buying hay from. You can buy hay from farm stores, however, it is a losing game. It's very pricey, and they usually only have alfalfa. Occasionally they will have a local supplier who gives them like pasture grass, and that's usually good stuff. But you want to talk to the people who are providing the hay, if you can, to see if that hay is sprayed with anything, and you need to decide for yourself how much spray you're willing to accept or not accept. And I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. Sometimes supply dictates your choices. The sheep have to eat. In winter, that becomes a real issue. But you should definitely talk to the person who supplies your hay, form a good relationship with them, bake them cookies or something, and maybe they'll cut you a small discount. That's always a good idea. Our hay comes from just down the road. A real nice older gentleman who takes care of his neighbors. I don't know that he gives us a discount, but he calls us first when he's got the hay baled and ready to go come autumn. He has a pasture as opposed to a monoculture field. I know that for a fact because when I pull the hay bales apart, I see clover, I see Johnson grass, I see Bermuda, I see everything that we have locally here in there. That is good because it continues what the sheep are used to throughout the winter. I also provide supplements. This is a rabbit hole, guys. You could go down this thing, and I mean, there is a lot of schools of thought. There are a lot of products available. I'll be honest, I kind of have a simplistic view of it. And you want to make sure that whatever mix or salt mix or mineral components that you purchase are safe for sheep. Sheep are quick to become toxic on copper, whereas other livestock need extra copper. So most products are fortified with extra copper. If you're raising sheep, you cannot use these products. It will cause your sheep to get copper toxemia, which is fatal. I've never had to deal with it directly, but Google can help you. There is a mineral mix at Tractor Supply that is safe for sheep. I simply use that. I make it freely available. I put it inside the shelters so that it won't get rained on. I don't keep it available all the time, but at least once a month I make it available to them. Furthermore, I have recently been providing supplemental protein. Most feed stores have options available. It comes in a big tub. It looks like a big block of like molasses or something. Again, same thing. You need to make sure that this has not been fortified with additional copper. Make sure that it is safe for sheep. My sheep love it. They come and they scrape their teeth on it, and sometimes in the warm weather when it gets a little softer, they will get it all over their face. I make sure they have that before lambing, after lambing, and during weaning, and then I try to make it available during winter as well. It's an added expense, but I do find that I have healthier animals, which is really my goal. I try to keep the protein and the mineral mix in the shelters. Shelter for sheep is really easy. A lot of times during a rainstorm, I'll look out in the window and the sheep are standing in the field anyway. They don't care. The hair or their wool is a natural rain jacket. The hair sheep do produce lanolin just like the wool sheep, so it's a water repellent substance that's in their hair or wool. That being said, I always provide shelter regardless. Shade is really important during the summer months. Shade trees are good. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those where we graze our sheep. As you can see, my shelters are either small shelters that I've built for lambing, which we'll talk about soon. Also, an old shed or a carport where I store other things. Really, anything works. Sheep tend to be pretty simple when it comes to shelter. You don't need to do much, but you do need to do something. Shade, cross breeze. You need to be aware from which cardinal direction your prevailing weather comes from. Ours typically in the winter comes out of the north, and in the spring the storms tend to come out of the south and west. So we face all of our open-faced buildings to the east, and that is kind of the best of both worlds. A lot of times I will just try to make the water centralized around the shelter. It's just easier for everybody. That way, if it is a hot day, the sheep don't have to go far from the shelter to get their water. If you can put it inside the shelter, that's even better, because it won't be in the sun and it won't get as hot. It'll still be warm water, but do what you can with what you have. I think I'm probably going to have to do a part 2 to this video, because I haven't even gotten to breeding or lambing or anything associated with that yet, and I do want to talk about those things. So I hope to have part 2 up soon.